do renewable projects and infrastructure projects, which are potentially the more pressing need, do they automatically have social license? And if not, how should investors and energy businesses operate? And I think the answer to that question is that they should operate on the assumption that they need to work really, really damn hard to gain the trust of the public and of the communities that their projects might impact. They might not have to do that, but they should definitely operate on the assumption that they should.
Hello and welcome to this special episode of Michelson Alexander Explains, produced with NLIT Australia ahead of their upcoming Leadership Summit and Expo in Melbourne. The conference will bring together the best thought leaders, innovators and disruptors from Australia's energy sector. You can expect an impressive lineup of speakers, including leaders from SCIRO, Siemens, Clean Energy Council, Origin Energy, Western Power, ARUP, AGIG, Schneider Electric and more. They will all tackle head-on the contentious issues in Australian energy right now and seek to find solutions. Today, we are going to be discussing Australia's transition to renewable energy. What exactly will this transition involve? How will we get there? Who will it affect? How do we ensure industries and workers are not left behind? Who's leading the charge? And the billion-dollar question, who's footing the bill? We are joined today by Patricia Boyce, the founder of Seed Advisory and board member for the Centre for New Energy Technologies, and Al Whittle, an associate in our renewable energy practice at Michelson Alexander. Thanks for joining us today, both of you.
Thank you, Tim.
So Al, we know that the entire world, including Australia, is transitioning to renewables in order to reach net zero by 2050. But what do we mean by a just transition?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, and one I will endeavour to answer. The term just transition refers to the social justice element of the energy transition from fossil fuels to renewables. In a just transition, the communities, families, individuals that are involved in the old energy system, in the fossil fuel energy system, continue to have a role in the new energy system, as well as capabilities to perform those roles. As our listeners likely know, delivering a just transition is much harder than my job of just defining it. There isn't a single action that we can take that will ensure a just transition will take place. It is a process, it's an ongoing process that needs to be factored into all of the decision making around the energy transition itself. So those are decisions being made by investors, big corporates who own energy projects, and governments, policymakers, etc. A good example that is close to home are the people and communities involved in coal and gas-fired power stations across the country that will be closed over the next couple of decades. Thinking about these projects through a social justice lens brings to light more tasks than just how to decommission a power plant. We also need to ensure that the people involved in those power plants still have access to good, relevant jobs, relevant to their skills, and opportunities once those power plants are gone.
And you talked about actually delivering a just transition. Do we think that this is realistically possible? And are there further policies required to ensure all Australians are supplied energy both affordably and equitably?
Yes, I'm optimistic. I do think that a just transition is possible. But regardless of whether it's achieved, I think that what we feel as people on the ground, and especially people on the ground in the communities and places where it will take place, I think what we will feel is a messy transition. Listeners might recall that many of these power plants, their timeframes for being closed are being brought forward by a matter of years. So delivering a just transition for those communities, for those people impacted by those closures, becomes much harder when the timeframes for the transition are shortened. Fortunately, we have some deep thinkers, I know Patricia just across the table, who are turning their minds to these problems. And in particular, it's worth our listeners reading the Million Jobs Plan, produced by the think tank Beyond Zero Emissions. It's a great example of the types of blueprints that we already have to deliver a just transition through good, new, secure, well-paying jobs for Australian people. They show that it is realistic. We just have to put our minds and our money to it.
I guess the question that, and this is a matter of my training, I started as an economist. So the question that I think we need to think hard about is whose money and for what exactly. So if we just think about, for example, if the SECV were recreated tomorrow in its full original glory in the sense of what its responsibilities are, it would never be the employer at the scale that it once was. Because the nature of jobs, both the white collar jobs and the blue collar jobs, has not only changed already, but is changing at an accelerating pace. In saying we need to aspire to jobs to people, then I guess the question that I think we need to confront is who exactly is paying for this transition? How do we disentangle the effects of the industrial revolution that's happening with digitalisation and the transition, because they're happening both at once. And it's not an easy thing to say we need to have these jobs for these communities, and in particular in the way that some communities are calling for, in place, because jobs in Northern Australia building massive solar farms are not the same as going to work in the Hunter Valley 5 days a week. They are fly-in, fly-out jobs during the construction phase, and a relatively small number of people on the ground during the operational phase, with operation of the plants possibly happening thousands of kilometres away. My problem with the just transition is, first of all, saying, well, how do we define which part is whose responsibility? But also that we need to simultaneously think about the changing nature of work and what that means for the sector. Because after all, electricity needs to continue to be affordable. Electricity is not a thing of itself. It's an instrument in achieving daily life and production. So affordability, what the sector pays as opposed to what the community funds generally, is a really important question, I think.
And you talk about where's the who's got the responsibility, and I think you can't talk about responsibility without looking at the federal government. And we know that this time last year, Australia was looking at an incredibly different energy and political landscape. Industry seemed to be leading the way. The coalition government seemed to be stalling behind a bit and remained very firm on emissions targets, and much to the dismay of other countries around the world. But now we have a new Labor government that's even legislated a 43% reduction on carbon emission levels below 2005 levels by 2030, which is, we should say, the strongest stance an Australian government has taken on emissions reductions to date. What impact do you think this has actually had on the transition?
It's speeded up the need for new transmission build and the recognition funding and the funding of at least part of that need. So that's an important bit. We've also had some people, not the usual suspects, going very keen to be involved in traditional energy companies. So witness the fight over AGL and to some extent the protracted prospective sale of Origin. So you've got people now saying, let's get involved in this because we can see it working differently. But the other thing, and it's really at risk of overtaking us, is this question about whether we can meet the targets, not just because they're really ambitious for Australia, but in the light of the new US supports available and the likelihood that the EU is going to in fact put in competitive supports. There's a real question about, even with the best will in the world in Australia, there are only so many hydrogen electrolyzers that can be built in the next decade. Very few of them might be in Australia relative to what people were thinking about initially. Legislating targets is one thing, meeting targets is another. And when you listen to the energy market institutions, you can hear their level of concern about ambition's one thing, meeting the ambition and delivering reliability might be another.
When we talk about facilitating this kind of transition, a lot of experts mention the importance of having a diverse energy mix and to maintain reliability on the network. Is that the case, and what does a reliable net zero energy mix actually look like?
Well, I think we're in a situation where none of us have any idea what it looks like in the end game. So there are near term, you can continue to build intermittent renewable energy sources, wind and solar, and you can supplement it with some storage, both relatively, like very short term and relatively short term. And by the time we get snowy 2.0, but quite long term.
Yes.
But that's one set of challenges. But then you've got, so how are we going to replace oil? What do we do about, green steel? What do we do about transport? What do we do about heavy transport? That's, there's hydrogen on the table, but there's quite a lot of argument about, is hydrogen going to meet those needs? Al's nodding, I'm thrilled.
It's contentious, isn't it?
But there's a bunch of things which are currently they're not in the too hard basket because people are working on them, but people kind of like to elide them when they're talking about it, because saying we're not entirely sure how we're going to deal with international shipping or long haulage transport up and down Australia. It's not a terrific thing to say when you're going, but we're going full pace, because there is that whole bucket of things we don't know. But the fact we don't know is why we need to keep pursuing a lot of things and not just a narrow set of things.
And you talked about hydrogen, and I will come back to that because that is a very important topic, as alluded to by Al's head nodding. So Prime Minister Albanese has just publicly backed in gas for the energy transition. What does he actually mean by this? What do we think the role of gas as a whole is going to be in Australia's energy transition?
Well, for a start, I think it's going to go on doing peaking and firming electricity for a fair while. Now, I don't know what a fair while means, but it probably means out to past 2035. The challenge is where you've got local jurisdictions who are much less keen on backing gas in, but the replacements look tricky. You can see that electrification might replace domestic usage of gas sooner rather than later, in the 2030s, realistically. But it's not clear that it's going to replace heavy industry usage. And I would also add, it's not obvious it's going to be cheaper either. There are real live questions about distribution network capacity in an electrified domestic sector, particularly in Victoria and some parts of South Australia, southern New South Wales, where gas is used for heating. So when you're stacking a whole bunch of demands up, you have to ask some questions about the capacity of the system to meet that.
There's been a lot of talk recently about the role of hydrogen in the renewable energy transition, and Australia becoming a hydrogen superpower for both domestic use and exports, with even countries like Japan and South Korea getting ready to sign hydrogen deals with Australia. Drawing from your own experience and the work that you've done with some of our clients in hydrogen, do you think the renewable hydrogen hype is justified?
To look beyond the premise of that exact question, I think is important, because we need to understand whether there are other solutions that are possible before we can think about implementing them. Alongside, the most obvious solution, we need to understand all the cards that we have on the table, and then make an assessment of whether it's going to be suitable. To Patricia's point earlier, there are lots of factors and lots of levels of demand as well on the existing systems. We need to understand whether or not a huge new demand of gas customers shifting over to the electricity system is going to be sustainable or even achievable. And in that context, whether there's an opportunity for renewable gases like hydrogen to plug the gap. Part of your question about the export opportunity, that is something that we really don't understand just yet. We don't know how hydrogen would be exported, but if we can answer that and come up with the best solution, then we can understand what that export value might be. As other nations across the world begin to phase out coal, I think we might find that our Australia's position as one of the top coal exporters will become less important, and that we'll need to find other export opportunities to make up for that lost revenue. And indeed, if hydrogen is proven to be a good export opportunity, it could plug that gap and more. And that's something that I'm very excited to hear more about and learn more about.
Hydrogen generally, I'm a yes and a no, or possibly a no and a yes. So I'm not. I put it this way: I remain to be convinced about the hydrogen in every home story, not least because there are economies of scale that are beneficial, and I struggle to see the economies of scale in the really small scale. I have an electrolyser on my driveway approach. But on the other hand, I think, okay, hydrogen at a very high level and ignoring the physics and the chemicals and all the rest of it looks like LNG. And if you can do LNG as an industry, you can do hydrogen. But, that's the LNG industry has scale, it has international backers, it has long-term contracts, and other than its economic contribution to Australia, it's connected to Australian energy markets by the thinnest of possible connections. I think that's a feature, not a bug. If we continue to think, as some of the energy institutions do, that hydrogen belongs in the regulated energy sphere, then we won't have an export hydrogen industry, in my view. We actually are going to have to think about it as being discrete from the regulated energy sector. And that's going to be a challenge because the institutions are currently, in fact, going, us belongs to us.
Yes. Yeah. Everyone wants a piece of the pie in some
Yes.
way.
Yeah.
That is the nature of the hydrogen hype, isn't it?
So Patricia and Al, you both worked on the community side of energy. So what can you actually tell us about the role of community support in the energy transition? And do renewables have an automatic social license to operate?
You will have seen that MLC ad where the tagline is, I just want to have what I have now. Actually, outside the energy nerd population, or to be nicer, what's called early uptakers, I actually think that's what the community wants, that the larger part of the community is not interested, for example, in its home energy setup participating in a market. So my own view is, so if we respect consumers' sovereignty, which we keep saying we're doing, then we can't push people into systems that they don't want to participate in. That's actually quite a technical challenge because, there's a point at which you have to turn people off or schedule them into a market of some form. I don't think we've there's quite a lot of work happening on, so what do those markets look like? But we actually have to wrestle with the other choice, I think, which is what if the customers refuse to pay? Because I think they just want to have what they're having.
An interesting example of that, adjacent example, I think that was drawn to my attention very recently was the problem of how we engage customers who live in rental properties in the energy transition. How can a renter have a solar panel on their house if that decision doesn't sit with them, it sits with the landlord? And how can you get a landlord to decide to put a solar panel on their rental property if they want as little touch points with the rental property as possible, and the renter vice versa with the landlord? They just want that flow of rent. How do we solve that? How do we encourage landlords to put rooftop solar panels or hydrogen stoves, or how do we make that happen? It's a tricky problem that we can't, no one's solving at the moment. Maybe that's our job.
I do think what we have to do though is we have to kind of avoid making repetitive errors. So we made, and we, in my view, keep repeating the error where we told people in effect that solar panels on their houses were basically free or prospectively money making. And we keep rolling out schemes that allow them to think that, although your solar system imposes costs on your neighbours and increasingly is imposing costs on the system as a whole. But we can't disturb the customers by saying to them, only tiny departures from this, it's free or effectively free. If we make an error of that kind, we need to reverse it really fast because otherwise we get stuck in positions which are really inefficient.
And that gets, I guess, to the communications perspective, which is, the meat of our work. How do we come up with a coherent narrative for the public that they can understand, and that continues to be true as the energy transition picks up pace. And if it does need to be refined, how is it refined so that each iteration of it also continues to be true? It's such a problem.
Yeah, no, I agree it's a problem because there's a bunch of uncertainty at the tail end of this, which I think we should be acknowledging more than we do. But I also accept that's a very hard message to deliver around, well, why are we doing what we're doing and at the speed at which we're doing it? Acknowledging that, some of these problems are still to be solved.
I was reminded this weekend of a transmission infrastructure project that is planned for Western Victoria, and which protesters against it occupy a pretty big space of the annual Dalesford Chill Out Parade, where they have tractors going down the main strip with signs saying "Stop AusNet's transmission project." I guess that goes back to Tilly's question: how do renewable projects and infrastructure projects, which are potentially the more pressing need, do they automatically have social license? And if not, how should investors and energy businesses operate? And I think the answer to that question is that they should operate on the assumption that they need to work really, really damn hard to gain the trust of the public and of the communities that their projects might impact. They might not have to do that, but they should definitely operate on the assumption that they should.
And you talk about gaining the trust of the public. How do you think customer demand is going to actually drive strategy and shape the transition as a whole?
I saw something earlier this week from Berkeley, they have an energy centre, and talking about the duck curve. And California spent quite a lot of time trying to urge people to shift their household consumption into the low price period. So, run your dishwasher at noon. And the dispiriting conclusion that they had drawn was that rooftop solar is increasing the speed, so that whatever demand response achievements they've had, you can't see it in the curve. There's just not enough adjustment. So there are marginal adjustments. You can run your dishwasher on delay. Certainly you can run mine. I could if I wanted to run the washing machine on delay. It's very annoying, but you can. But you get up and it's dark, you turn the lights on. There's a certain proportion of our consumption which is not realistically shiftable. Now, domestic batteries kind of offer you that opportunity, but they're a very expensive solution to, they replace the grid as your battery, but they do so right now very expensively. It's very hard to justify that. So I don't see community demand shifting more than at the margin to actually change that sort of diurnal pattern of consumption. And that is one of the reasons, going back to your earlier question, why you need so many dogs in the fight, because if we're relying on customers to shift, and customers are going, I'm sorry, it's dark when I get up and turning the lights on, then we need a plan B.
And I guess going back to that just transition we were talking about earlier, how do we actually manage the transition for those end users who are potentially going to fall through the cracks? Because you've got high income end users who will decarbonise because they have the means to do so, and you'll have the lower income earners who will likely have to be supported by the government. What about the end users in the middle, for example, renters that you spoke about before, people living in the region of Australia?
Well, I have to say my first best solution to this is the energy system needs to be as efficient and low cost as it can be. My challenge in these circumstances is that solar on every roof is not necessarily part of an efficient, effective solution. I know this is one of those ideas we've kind of clamped onto, but scale matters. So as an economist, you would say the first best solution is electricity should be as cheap as it possibly can during the transition. And then you're thinking about, okay, once you've achieved that, what's the population who you need to provide specific assistance to? The problem with the sort of omnibus, we need everything to go into this plan, is how do you interrogate the plan to make sure it is as cheap as it can be as the first step?
Well, that's all we've got time for today. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for tuning into this special episode of Michelson Alexander Explains. If you want to hear more about some of the topics and themes that we discussed today, then come along to NLIT. NLIT Australia's Summit, Leadership Summit and Expo will be held on March 22nd and 23rd at the Melbourne Convention Exhibition Centre, and registrations are still open. You can find all the details at nlit-australia.com. And if you like today's podcast, don't forget to subscribe to Michelson Alexander Explains wherever you listen to podcasts.